Addiction is a social issue. There are societies where there's no addiction, and there's societies where there's lots of addiction. It's not just in every society there are certain people who fall prey to the drug and become addicted. That's not what happens.
Okay, Bruce, welcome to the show. To get started, I think an interesting place to begin with might be if you could tell us about your experiences working in, I think it was Canada's first methadone clinic whenever you're around the age of 30, and
Yes.
what you might have learned from that experience.
Let me tell you a little bit of the background before that, and then I will, which is that in 1970, when I was 30, I moved to Canada. And this was a time when we knew everything about addiction. Like, we knew that addiction was restricted to a small number of drugs. These drugs somehow hijacked a person's willpower, made it impossible for them to resist, and gave them terrible withdrawal symptoms, which were unbearable. They just couldn't fight the withdrawal symptoms. So I knew that. And I went to Vancouver, and I went to work in the university, but part of that was to work in the methadone clinic. Now, if I had been a clinical psychologist, I would have been doing therapy with people in the methadone program, trying to cure them of this disease, of this really demon possession by a demon drug. But I wasn't a clinical psychologist. My background prior to that has been in medical schools. I was a research psychologist with primates, monkeys. So my job, since I wasn't a clinical psychologist, was to talk to these guys, the young heroin users, and tell them that really they should stop using heroin, even though they were getting the methadone now, because it would be to their advantage to do that, even though they were addicted forever, as I knew from having learned it in graduate school. Even though they were addicted forever, they should stop using the heroin because they wouldn't get in trouble with the police. And in those days, they were facing very long jail sentences in Vancouver. So I did. I gave them this good advice. And it was a tremendous stroke of luck for me, because I was in the position, I had no power over them. I couldn't, if they disobeyed me and continued to use heroin on top of the methadone, I had no way to throw them off the program or to punish them in any way. I had no power at all. I was just a consultant as far as they were concerned. So they were free to tell me the truth because I had no power. And so they explained to me in various ways that really they were going to continue taking heroin. And they explained to me what the life of a junkie was like. And I came to understand that they were telling me a sort of an adventure story. They were telling me about how most of the time, they outwitted the police, and they outwitted the owners of stores from whom they robbed stuff, and they outwitted car owners when they stole their car radios. And they got together and they told stories about square johns. Now, square johns are people like me, people who, we might have our car radio stolen, for example. But they explained to me that square johns were very hypocritical, and they thought they shouldn't be taking this dreaded drug. But really, the square johns did everything, did things just as bad. They weren't quite as spectacular and they weren't quite as interesting, but square johns cheated on their taxes and they cheated on their wives and all this. So they had a really clear worldview in which the junkie was a kind of a hero, a kind of an anti-establishment person. And by the way, they liked the word junkie. They identified as junkies because junkies were people who could take a great big fat needle, ram it right in a vein in their arm, and experience the heroin rush And people were kind of afraid of that. In fact, I would bring them into my class and they wouldn't actually inject themselves, but they show the needle and that the students are shrinking back. And so they liked being junkies. And this was I was amazed. This destroyed what I had learned in graduate school about addiction. Well, I was just going to finish that by saying, in a way that I have a huge debt to these guys because they taught me that really what I had learned in graduate school was wrong.
To me, this story is hugely significant because what it brings up is that, they've essentially chosen I don't want to say chosen, but they're opting to take heroin, et cetera, and live this kind of life because the society that they live in doesn't provide a sufficient level of meaning to sustain them. So the alternative, what they're choosing, is a lot more meaningful and a lot more exciting than the other route as they seen it. And that seems to be maybe at the heart of the issue here.
That is the heart of the issue, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a life that their parents would have chosen for them. It wasn't a life that they would have chosen for themselves, but it was a way better life than just having absolutely nothing to do. Or, as one person put it to me, one of these junkies said, "What do you want me to do? Be a janitor?" Nothing. I don't mean to offend janitors, but what he was telling me is that he had nothing in his life other than the drama of this adventurous life. And I knew that he was, it really was high drama in those days. He was risking being caught by the police, which meant a terrible beating and years in prison. So it wasn't, it wasn't imaginary. Our laws have changed quite a bit. He wouldn't be facing a terrible beating or years in prison now, but he was then.
I grew up with some people that were very badly affected by addiction. And as we were, getting towards our late teens and everything, their basic mentality was to live for the weekend because their view on the society they were going into, work, corporate life, et cetera, was just so mundane and so mind numbing that why not live for the weekend? Why not just go and take a pile of drugs and do all this, And whenever I heard about that story, it just reminded me of that. Now, what I'd like to sort of move to now, Bruce, maybe would be why is it not enough to look at addiction through the lens of psychology? So you're a professor in or you were a professor in psychology before you retired, and you're a trained psychologist. But why isn't psychology enough for understanding addiction?
Because addiction is a social issue. That is, there are societies where there's no addiction, and there's societies where there's lots of addiction. It's not just in every society there are certain people who fall prey to the drug and become addicted. That's not what happens. And it's not enough because the really important insights into psychology now, today, are not coming from psychology. They're not coming from neuroscience either. They're coming from anthropology. They're coming from sociology. So really, what has happened to me is that I started my career as a medical psychologist, essentially, and very quickly switched. I now do most of my reading and work in history and anthropology because I'm still working on addiction. I've been working on it my entire life since 1970, but psychology just doesn't get you there. Now, may I say this too? I do not mean to offend psychologists. My best friends are psychologists, and I'm a psychologist, and psychologists have something to give, which is really important. You come in and you sit down in a room with somebody who actually cares that you've got a big problem. Well, that's a gift. But we have unfortunately oversold that gift to the point where now, for example, where I live, we're talking about compulsory treatment, forcing people to see psychologists. Well, for most people, that means we're wasting their time. It's no longer a gift. And we, of course, can't cure it.
The big thing I think I'm maybe that's really starting to hit home for me in interviewing yourself and people like Oliver Morgan and even people like Ian McGilchrist is that you can't really separate human beings from their environment and their cultural context. You can't take people out of the context that surrounds them on a day-to-day basis. So what I'd maybe like to ask about now, Bruce, is what is your theory of dislocation?
Well, I use the word dislocation as a shorthand to refer to the fact that in contemporary society, people are cut off from all kinds of things which were formerly important. For example, many people are cut off from their families, and many people are cut off from being able to trust their nation, and many people are cut off from religion, and many people are cut off from just a local community, a community in which people are supportive. And so I use the word dislocation for that because I suppose it's a medical metaphor. It's like your shoulder could be dislocated. That doesn't mean it's amputated. It's still there. Your arm is still there, but doesn't articulate anymore. And that's what I mean. That many people are not articulating very well with their society. And we could say, well, that's their fault. They're not trying hard enough. But it isn't that. It's that happens in societies to masses of people at the same time. For example, here in Western Canada, where we're speaking, we had thousands of people who were not dislocated and had essentially no addiction problem. I'm talking about the Native Indians in this place. And I've done a lot of work learning about the Native Indians in this place. They had essentially zero dislocation because their tribal groups were very tight, they're very solid and well integrated, and they had religions and they had leaders and they had traditions and all this stuff. So they weren't dislocated and they had no addiction. And then along came us guys from Northern Europe, and we said, well, look, you can't have that religion anymore, and you can't have that tribal government anymore, and you can't catch all the whales you want anymore, and shoot all the moose you want, and catch all the salmon you want anymore, but you can't have a nice village, and we'll give you a pickup truck. Those guys became, that's super dislocated. And what happened, well, these people went from no addiction to basically, in many places, 100% alcohol addiction. And then we said, well, why is that? Why are these guys getting addicted? And the answer was, they just can't handle alcohol. But that's not the answer. The answer is they just can't handle dislocation, and nobody can handle dislocation. And when you're dislocated, that is, in the sense that I've described it, when you're dislocated, you've got to have something to fill the void, right? And one thing that will fill the void, now when these young men in the methadone clinic that I talked to, they were filling the void by becoming part of the junkie culture. And the natives can fill for years, for decades here in British Columbia, the natives were primarily filling the void by getting drunk with their friends and acting out and talking about how brave they were and what warriors they were, and going home and hitting their wives. Not cool. So I think that dislocation provides a major part of the explanation for addiction, but not all of it, but a major part of it. And we do these injustices, like we say, well, the natives are alcoholic because they can't handle alcohol, or we say, well, the guys in the city are junkies because they can't handle heroin. Well, that's not why.
The metaphor that comes to mind for me here, whenever I hear you speak about these things, is the whole story about fish swimming in water. I think in some ways, like human beings, we're all sort of swimming in an invisible cultural soup And when you go to a new place and you disrupt that soup and you put new things into it, you take things, whatever, you're taking something away from people and you're disrupting something that is as life-giving and as sustaining as food and water is for them. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think is that obviously I'm just, is that reasonable to say is what I'm asking?
I think that's a very, very good way of putting it. And I think that's the true epidemic of our time, which is that we have so many people who are really not sustained by their communities and all the rest of it. And we have so many ways of turning to addiction. So, and then we say, oh, well, that's why they're taking heroin, or that's why they're drinking too much. But we really understate the problem, because it isn't just that they're taking heroin or they're drinking too much. They're also joining strange kinds of cults like QAnon, cults where which lead to violence and chaos, really. So I think we understate our addiction problem, but I do think the root cause is there in dislocation. But I want to qualify that, if I may. There's another thing we call addiction, and that's like, let's say a person just takes Prozac all the time, too much, and they won't stop, or they take OxyContin all the time, too much, they won't stop. Now, sometimes those people are not dislocated. Sometimes they just hurt, and these drugs are basically painkillers, either for emotional pain or physical pain, or both. So I don't think we can necessarily pin all serious addiction on dislocation, but a hell of a lot of it. And I think we have to recognize this other fact too, that people hurt, and sometimes they insist on taking these drugs because they can't stand the pain.
What's your definition of addiction, Bruce?
I have two. As I just said, I have two definitions. They are the main definitions in the Oxford English Dictionary. Okay. May I say this? One of my pet peeves in our field is that people are allowed to have their own definition of addiction. And I say, no, we're doing science here, man. You can't have your own definition. We have to talk about what it is. And if we go to the Oxford English Dictionary, we'll find out that there are two contemporary meanings of the word. And one is a kind of a devotion to a lifestyle. So a person can be devoted to the junkie lifestyle, or a person can be devoted to the barroom lifestyle, or a person can be devoted to the political fanatic lifestyle, or anything. And it's a real devotion that people are willing to die, literally, for these kinds of devotion. Or people can be devoted to Jesus. And I'm not, here again, I'm not saying it, I don't mean to insult Christians. I'm not a Christian, but I respect Christianity. I think the interesting thing is that this kind of addiction as devotion, which is the oldest English meaning of the word, is a positive thing as well as a negative thing. I think most people who are devoted to Jesus are pretty good people, and they're doing good work. Some of them of course, are fanatics and dangerous, but not all. So I think the one you asked me, what is my definition? I've said there's two definitions. That's the first, and that incidentally is the oldest definition in the English language. That's the way Shakespeare used the word.
So just to confirm, that's a devotion to a lifestyle. Is there anything else, or is that just the sentence?
Well, okay. It's just a strong devotion to a lifestyle. An immoderate, we could say, devotion to a lifestyle, but it could be a good thing. Like if you're a wonderful scientist or a wonderful maker of videos, and you devote yourself to that, it's a good thing for everybody. That's one meaning of addiction. Although it can be a very bad thing too, obviously, if you're devoted to heroin or methamphetamine or QAnon. I do mean to insult. No.
Okay. Definition number 2. What's the second one?
The second one is using a drug immoderately and stubbornly, recalcitrantly using a drug. And like, as I've said, some people use, if we take heroin as an example, some people use it because they're devoted to the junkie lifestyle. Some people are addicted to it in that way. Other people just hurt. And they can't sleep, they can't function. Do you know anything about chronic pain? I happen to have been in chronic pain, so I do. When you're in chronic pain, you can't function. You need the drug. And I'm not saying that I was addicted to it. I wasn't. But yeah, so there are those two meanings of addiction. And I think our field really is an intellectual disaster area. And I think we're going to get out of the disaster area in part by recognizing that when we talk about addiction, we're talking about these two things as if they're the same, but they're not the same.
I think, now I might be misquoting here, but it's worth bringing up the point anyway, just to address it. I've heard Gabor Mate say something along the lines of, I'm not sure, but along the lines of almost everybody in our culture has some form of addiction. And I'm curious to ask you, if we live in a dislocated society and culture, how prevalent do you think this problem is? Are we all addicts, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I consider myself an expert on that because I'm 83 years old, and I live on this island, which has a lot of retired people here, and we talk a lot about addiction in our lives. And what I would say is not so much that everybody is addicted, but that most people have been addicted at some point in some way that was either a big problem or maybe it was a big success and it really worked with them. But I think most people have in their lives a period of addiction. I think when we get older, if we're lucky, like I'm a lucky guy, we don't have to be addicted anymore. And we can sort of live moderate lives and take care of our grandchildren and catch a fish and, do the kinds of things which are nice. But I think Gabor is right. Not so much that everybody is addicted, but that a great many people have had dangerous addictions in their lives and they got over them. But that's the other thing that I think and Gabor mentions this too. By the way, Gabor's a friend. He mentions this too. Most people do have a dangerous addiction at some time in their life, or at least some manner, some portion of a dangerous addiction, but most of them get over it. Now, some don't get over it, of course, and that's why we have clinicians and psychiatrists and so forth, because not everybody gets over it, but most people do. And the really interesting study in my mind is the study of natural recovery. That is, you can just follow people and you can say, well, who in this group has been addicted but is no longer, and hands go up. And then you say, okay, tell me about that. Tell me about how it is that you're not addicted anymore, but you were. And people love to tell these stories, I can tell you, because it's a life affirming story, right? I used to drink like a fish, people would say, but now I don't. And why don't I? I don't because, well, my daughter one day looked me in the eye. I'm just making this story up, but this is the kind of story you get. One day my daughter looked me in the eye and she said, "Dad, you drink too much. It's hard on Mom." And well, I found a way not to drink too much. And it's that kind of story, life-affirming stories of people getting over their addiction, really important. Sometimes these life-affirming stories have a psychologist in them. And sometimes you say, well, I talked to a really good shrink and he helped me out. He helped me to see what I could do a little bit differently. But the majority do not have a professional in them. The majority of people who get over these kinds of serious, dangerous addictions don't have a professional in the story. And again, not to say anything bad about addiction professionals like myself, but only to say that we're a bit oversold at this point, and that's a problem.
For sure, for sure. Now, has your understanding and research in this area informed or changed your approach to your own life in any way?
Of course.
Tell me more.
I could tell you, what would I tell you? I'm a work addict. I'm a reformed work addict. And I used to spend all the time in the laboratory. And in fact, my daughter one day looked me in the eye and said, "Hey, that's that kind of a story." Yeah, I don't do that anymore. And everybody's happier. So I spend my time taking care of my children. I have 4 children and grandchildren. And I take care of my wife, and she takes care of me. And it's way better.
Fantastic. Now, I've heard you speak elsewhere about, you're very involved, like you're part of like discussion groups in the island where you're from and stuff. You organize those things. Community seems to be a big part of your life as well.
Well, you're right. And yeah, I think I know where you're going with that. You're going to say, have I learned to be a community oriented person from my involvement with addiction? Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So yeah, now you will, if you were to follow me through the day, you'd see the various communities that I rely on and am actively involved in. Yes, of course.
That's fantastic. So, this all centers around, our problem with addiction all centers around a fragmentation in our society. And I'm curious to ask you, Bruce, where do you think this fragmentation started? What are the roots of the fragmentation in our culture? Like, for me, things like maybe the decline in religion. I'm talking about like our current Western culture. When did things really start getting off track here?
Well, that's a huge question. And I know you're not going to give me a whole semester to answer it, but that's what I would want to answer that question. You can find it way back. Like I'm reading Roman history now, and it's quite amazing. Like the Roman Empire was a period of terrible dislocation and fragmentation, partly because Rome basically took over the whole Mediterranean and European world. And in doing that, everybody became a cog in a machine, right? Everybody, for example, had to pay taxes to the Roman Empire. Well, they didn't know what the tax money was for. What did they care? And they had to follow the Roman law. They have to follow all the instructions which came from Rome. And they didn't know why. What they did know is that prior to the Roman Empire, there had been all these feuding little kingdoms and I don't know what to call them, microstates, city-states, this sort of thing. They'd been at war all the time. Rome brought peace. So people accepted the Roman Empire, but the cost of the Roman Empire was the loss of community and the loss of understanding what's going on. And of course, Roman Empire disappeared, and we went into a dark age. But we've emerged into modernity. So here on this island, you see our beautiful forest behind me. That tree you see right behind me, that one, I can't cut that down because it's my tree. I own it. I can't cut it down because the Islands Trust, which is our master here, says if you cut down that tree, you're going to have to pay a huge fine because of global warming. Well, I care about global warming. I voted green, but still I want to cut down that tree. But you see what I'm saying? That it's that we're integrated into these huge systems which we only partly understand. So on this island, we vote Green. Our member of the provincial legislature is the Green candidate. And yet people hate it that they have to follow these rules because they don't really understand how these rules come about and why that tree matters so much to global warming. And that's the inevitable nature of the expansion of civilization. So what I'm saying is, I think that, at the deepest level, the problem that we face, the problem of fragmentation and dislocation, is an inevitable result of global civilization. And I think we have to solve it, because I think that the consequences, the psychological consequences of globalization, of dislocation and fragmentation, are enormous. I don't think we really appreciate how big they are. I think we have to find out how to solve that problem, but I don't know. I don't know how to solve it. I'm a retired guy. I haven't been able to answer that question. But I think we do have to answer it. And what makes me happy is that there's a lot of people thinking about that question, some of whom I saw on the list of speakers you have for your show here. And a lot of people are thinking about that question, and I don't know how we're going to solve it.
It's just something that comes to mind for me here now is, obviously, if you look at our evolutionary past, we existed in these small tribes of hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, and this is sort of the way of life we're supposedly adapted and evolved for. And then as we move into modern civilization, you have agriculture, and you start to get these big communities and big masses of people coming together. And then for me, maybe things like these large-scale religions like Christianity or Buddhism or Islam, what they essentially do is they provide a technology for bringing large groups of people together and giving them that cultural identity. But in the past, since the Enlightenment, that has, that's massively declined, and we're moving into a secular culture. So this thing that was giving that sense of connection has disappeared, and maybe that's part of what's going on here as well. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. I think Christianity for a long time was part of the solution to that problem, but it's not working anymore. We're de-Christianizing pretty fast, and I'm not a Christian, but I regret that we're de-Christianizing, and I think we need a new ideology. And I don't know what the new ideology will be. I'm hoping Greta Thunberg will tell us, or some, or some of these, some of the really, really wonderful contemporary thinkers are trying to help think our way out of this kind of problem. But I don't think we've got the solution.
In your view, what's the most dangerous addiction in our world?
QAnon. I think the most dangerous addiction in my world, which is the North American world, is the addiction to political fanaticism. And I think when I listen to the people who are politically fanatic, I agree with them when they say that, the life is just not good enough. We've got to do something. We've got to change this. But I disagree with their solution. Their solution is, kind of murderous and kind of authoritarian and kind of horrible. But I do think they're responding to a real problem. But I think they may be, they may do us in that if we have a political collapse, which looks like we may have, for example, in the United States pretty soon, if we have a political collapse, then everything becomes unpredictable. It terrifies me. And I think that our responsibility, this is my belief, nobody agrees with me. I think that our responsibility as psychologists is to psychologize these political issues not to take everyone into our office and cure them of their political fanaticism, but rather to identify that this kind of political fanaticism is not stupidity, it's not cruelty, it's not any of that. It's perfectly understandable. It's a perfectly understandable to in terms of addiction, for example. Now, I don't think everything is addiction, but think about why those guys in the methadone clinic were addicted to fighting the cops and living in the junkie culture. It's because they had shit for a life. That's why they really didn't have a life. And think about why these political people are willing to, attack the U.S. Capitol or to elect morons as their political leaders. It's the same. It's filling a gap. If you can't fill the gap in a constructive and positive way, you have to fill it the best way you can. And even though the effects are ultimately murderous, and that's what I fear.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's also, I suppose, quite scary as well. In terms of other dangerous addictions I've heard you speak about elsewhere is maybe our addiction to money, and you have people like CEOs who might be highly addicted to money and power, et cetera, and then they get into positions of power, and then because that's a high status role in our society, other people want to emulate that, so it sort of perpetuates itself. And then you've got influencers and stuff as well now, where people are getting into the situation, and then they've got to the top of the ranks or whatever, and then they're sharing their worldview. So more and more people are wanting these things that aren't necessarily going to lead to a good life for them or to a good life for the rest of the world too.
Yeah, I think that I think that there's a whole zoo full of dangerous addictions, and addiction to money and power is right up there. And I think that I haven't met enough of these people, but I've met some. And they are so understandable. And, it almost feels like I'm home if I'm talking to a person who's addicted to, let's say, money or power or political fanaticism, or if I'm talking to a person who's addicted to alcohol or heroin. I don't think I need to change my profession to do that. Now, I'm a little worried because I'm very old, and maybe old guys who've been studying something for 50 years, it kind of comes to dominate their thinking as if there were no other ways of understanding this problem. So I'm not saying that there's no other ways of solving this problem, but I'm saying that addiction provides a kind of a microscope through which we can look at a lot of problems and learn something about them. We're smarter if we use that particular microscope. And there's probably other microscopes we could use to solve these or to examine and to analyze these same social problems. But I found addiction to be a very useful one.
Just preparing for this interview and getting a basic understanding of what you've been researching and learning about and teaching the past, was it 50 years or whatever?
More than that.
More than that. It's sort of like once you see it, it's hard to unsee it. I'm sort of seeing it everywhere now. I'm sort of looking at everything through this lens. Probably just because it's probably not going to be there forever, but I'm starting to just see through this lens, and it's things are starting to sort of make sense, I suppose. And then,
if I could just interrupt there, yeah, it is hard for me to unsee it too. On the other hand, I want to be really careful to say that it's not the only way to see it. But it's a helpful way. It seems to me a very useful way.
Yeah. So we're nearly 45 minutes into this conversation, Bruce, and we haven't yet spoken about the thing that you're most well known for. You're behind one of the most interesting psychology experiments ever. I don't even know what you call a psychology experiment, but one of the most interesting scientific experiments ever done. Could you maybe tell us about Rat Park and what you learned from conducting this experiment? Maybe just to give a brief overview for someone that might not have heard it before.
Yes. I'm glad we've come at it this way, saving Rat Park for the end rather than the beginning, because I love Rat Park, of course, but I think that these larger issues are really where it's at. but 50 years ago, everybody knew what caused addiction. Addiction was basically a problem of heroin and a few other drugs. And this heroin, you take it and it kidnaps your willpower, basically. And then you have to take it forever after. And it's largely because of the withdrawal symptoms, because the withdrawal symptoms are like torture. And we knew that for two reasons. One is that junkies would all tell us, "Oh, I can't stop. I'm not choosing this. I'm out of control." Now, these are the same junkies that they said anything else, we wouldn't believe them because we thought they were crazy liars, but we believe them when they say that. And the other thing which made that idea seem irrefutable is the rat studies. And the rat studies were done with a little box called a Skinner box. Has nothing to do with flaying the rat. It's the rat's in a Skinner box, and there's a little bar on the side of the box. And if a little lever, and if the rat presses the little lever, he gets a little surge of heroin through a tube that's connected to his jugular vein by a catheter. And that means he gets a little rush from the drug. And everybody knew about these experiments. Like everybody knew. Because under certain circumstances, the rats would just keep taking this stuff. They keep pressing the little lever, getting a little surge, and eventually they die. They just forget about everything else, just press the lever. And there you see was the proof of the dominant theory of addiction, that and what the junkies said. Well, it's now obvious, although it wasn't so obvious then, I must say, but it's now obvious that there's something wrong with that experiment, because what you're doing is you're putting a rat in solitary confinement. And of course, not everybody knows it, but rats are extremely social creatures. They're called a colonial species, meaning they're never alone. They're never in a box by themselves. And so we have rats that you test them in this box, and then when you're tired of having them in the box, you put them in a solitary cage. You essentially put them in lifelong solitary confinement, and then you're surprised that they take a lot of heroin. But of course, if you put a human being in solitary confinement, they'll do anything for a fix of any kind of mind-altering stuff, because their mind is going crazy. So, of course, the logical experiment seemed to be in those days that we'll put some rats in solitary confinement, and we'll put some rats in an ideal rat community. Now, it's easy to make an ideal rat community. It's very hard to make an ideal human community, but it's easy to have an ideal rat community because all they need is males and females and a place to hide. And then they mound up the stuff on the floor and they make nests, and the females have great big litters of rat pups, and the males run around showing off and having parties. And that's pretty much all there is to a rat community. So we put rats in isolated cages, and we put rats in Rat Park. And of course, we paint great big pictures of trees and just like these on the wall, because this is British Columbia. So these are British Columbia rats. And then we give them 2 water bottles, one of which contains just plain old H2O, and one of which contains water with a lot of morphine in it. Now, morphine and heroin are essentially the same. Heroin is diacetylmorphine. And we found a very big difference in the rats in the isolated cages drink lots more under various conditions. Sometimes we get them all hooked first. That is, sometimes we give the rats lots of morphine before we do the experiment so that we know they're going to have withdrawal symptoms, and sometimes we don't. So we just put them in there and let them see what they want. But in both cases, we get the same result, which is that the rats in the cages love the morphine and they act as if they're addicted to it. Now, how would you know if a rat was addicted? You really wouldn't. But what we know is that they drink a lot of it and they're a bit sluggish. Whereas the ones in the cages are running around making babies and taking care of babies and all this. That experiment, it seemed to our little group of researchers, wasn't just me, of course. There were several of us who did this. But according to us, this changed the world. This changed the whole understanding of addiction, because it wasn't what we thought it was. The rats don't prove anything because they're isolated rats. They prove nothing. However, it didn't change the world. In fact, it just sank like a stone in the psychological literature. Although, of course, many serious researchers took it seriously, and there's been a whole bunch of follow-up research, and so we can say this result is basically right. And I don't need to go through all the complications of the follow-up research. It's not simple. There are many better experiments done than Rat Park now, but they reached the same conclusion, which is that there's nothing irresistible about heroin or any of these drugs. There's nothing irresistible for a rat which has an opportunity to have a social life. That's an established fact. So that means that what was once the established truth about addiction is not true. And so the rest of my career has been trying to say, well, okay, if that's not true, why is there addiction? And I've concluded that something like this dislocation theory, but that's not really proven in the same kind of way, because it's based on history, it's based on archaeology, it's based on anthropology. But come on, that's not really science, is it? So we're I think we're not certain of anything, but what has happened is that there has been over the decades since we did the Rat Park experiment, and partly because of the Rat Park experiment, but also partly because of other very important experiments that happened around the same time, we really are in a period of change now, where there is no longer a single established truth about addiction. There is, in fact, a number of quite reasonable alternatives. And we don't quite know which of them is right, but they all do seem to have something to do with dislocation and isolation. But I just say that because that's my axe to grind.
Okay, so I think this is fascinating, but it's also, there are a couple of examples in recent human history which show a similar pattern. Could you maybe tell us about Vietnam veterans that were addicted to heroin returning to normal society?
Yeah, tremendously important piece of work. In Vietnam, in the 1960s and 50s and 70s, the American soldiers there had a tremendous problem with heroin addiction and heroin use. And of course, in those days, they didn't make a distinction between using heroin and being addicted to it, but some of them people were really addicted. And the prediction was the end of the world, that those soldiers would return to the United States and all become thieves and murderers and destroy the country. It was a terrible fear. And So the Lee Robbins and some other people did a really important follow-up study on what happened to people to soldiers when they returned after being heroin users in Vietnam. And what happened is that most of them, something like 90%, were no longer heavy heroin users. A few continued to be moderate users, but basically the large majority just stopped altogether. Now, why is that? Well, they'd returned to their communities, and they weren't out there killing people for no good reason. Well, that's a pretty big difference in environments. Now, we could argue that that maybe their communities weren't all that wonderful, but they were a lot better than where they were and what they were having to do when they were in Vietnam, which was basically destroy communities and people.
For me, I just think those two examples really illustrate the core essence of what we're speaking about here. But now I'm going to ask you a question that I have a feeling you're going to just pass it off because you're retired now, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Let's say that you were put in the position of advising policymakers, even in Canada, about how to design a society fit for sobriety, the human version of Rat Park, and you had to give a presentation. What would be some of the key points you would be telling those policymakers about how to set up our society that it's going to be less likely to fall into mass addiction?
Well, again, I will need a semester to answer this question. But I would start by saying, don't design anybody's society. They've got to design their own society. And people left on their own are pretty good at designing societies. What policymakers have to do is to establish boundaries. I mean, there are certain things which can't happen. Like, for example, I can't go out and cut that tree. Okay, I can't go out and cut that tree, but I can form little community groups. I've done that with my friends, and I don't want any policymaker telling me how to do that. They say, okay, I can't cut the tree. Explain to me clearly why I can't cut that tree, and give me space and give me time. And this is happening everywhere. You know, if you look for it, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about just as well as I do. If you look for it, you find people are creating social life everywhere. And what policymakers have to do is to facilitate that. Mm-hmm. Oh, the group needs a room so you can have a meeting once a week. Oh, well, okay, we got a room. You know, or your group needs a little bit of publicity. Well, yeah, we could help with that. Or, but by the way, you can't cut down that tree, or you can't write on the wall in the room. Okay. So I think the role of policymakers can't be oversold, just like the role of psychologists shouldn't be oversold. We don't want the policymakers telling us how to make groups. We want the policymakers encouraging us to make groups and supporting it. So is that passing off the question?
No, I think that's a really interesting perspective. So it's almost like a combination of a decentralization of power and also creating the conditions where social life can flourish, you know, making it really easy to set up these groups and run them and providing the right conditions so that it happens naturally.
And this is happening, like in the UK, I'm aware of the recovery movement, right? Recovery groups are springing up all over, right? And they're specifically for recovery from addiction, but they have their own directions. Like some of them are religious and some of them are anti-religious and very cool. That's all good. And they don't have to be just for recovery. They can be for for people who don't need to recover, then maybe they'll never need to recover.
For sure. For sure. Okay. Well, just two more questions now to finish up, Bruce. Three books you'd recommend for mental health professionals that want to have a better understanding of addiction. We would, of course, recommend The Globalization of Addiction. But are there three others that you might suggest for people to better understand this phenomenon?
Well, there's at least two. There is Rebecca Lemon's new book, which is called Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England. And it makes it clear that the first definition, which I gave of addiction, is absolutely terribly important in the English language and in English culture. It's always been, it's with us, and so she quotes Shakespeare a lot, and so forth. That's one. Another one is Gilbert Malcolm Sproat's book, and the title is Scenes from Savage Life. I think that's what it's called. It's written about Canadian Indians, and he wrote it about 1868. And it's really important because he shows how rich the cultural life was of Canadian Indians on the west coast of British Columbia, where I live and where you now are. He shows that, and it's a brilliant book. It's so brilliant that Charles Darwin took it very seriously and cites it in his Descent of Man.
If you're struggling for a third, we're going to include three recommendations. So The Globalization of Addiction, and those two, one from, is it Rebecca Lemon? She's called, is that right?
Lemon is correct, yeah. And the other guy from Sprout.
We'll link to them in the reading list for the event. So yeah, that's three, I think, excellent recommendations. And then the last question here is, if you could get a letter to everybody in the world currently struggling with an addiction, like quite a serious one, what might be some of the key points you would say in that letter?
Well, I've made the biggest one already, which is, I'm 80. I know lots of people who've had addictions just as serious as yours, and they don't have them anymore, and they're living happily on Pender Island. So this thing can be beaten. Don't let anyone tell you that addiction is a permanent problem, but you have to change your life. But you probably don't have a great life anyway. Might as well change it. And then come on over to Pender Island and tell me the story.
Brilliant. And so brucekalexander.com. Great articles on there as well. I think you have one on Rebecca Lemon's work. You've got one, I thought it was quite interesting. It was Jordan Peterson, Viktor Frankl, and what is it?
That's the third book.
Man's Search for Meaning.
Man's Search for Meaning. Everybody's got to read Man's Search for Meaning.
For sure. Well, Bruce, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today and learn from you. I've never had this thought about a human being before, but if anybody deserves a knighthood, you definitely deserve a knighthood for your services to our understanding of addiction over the years. So thank you very much. And I want to wish you all the best for whatever you decide to do next.
Well, thank you very much, and good luck with your project here. I think it's very exciting. Will I get to see this thing? I probably have to pay to see it, right? I'm going to see the other speakers.
You'll get VIP all access, no charge, don't worry. And yeah, we'll send you everything when it's ready.
Good luck with the project.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for asking great questions.